They laughed at what they didn't understand. They always do. To the men crouched behind their cannon on that damp Virginia morning, the object climbing into the pale sky looked ridiculous. A wobbling globe of silk tethered by ropes. A circus toy, nothing more. Someone shouted that they ought to take a shot at it just to see it pop. No one knew that in a few minutes that fragile bubble would begin relaying their exact position to Union guns hidden miles away. The first shells landed short. The second volley was closer. By the third, the laughter stopped. It was April 1862. The American Civil War had reached its second year, and for the first time in history, men were learning that the sky could look back. Long before that morning, one man had imagined it: Thaddeus Constantine Lowe. He wasn't a soldier or a West Point engineer or anyone the War Department trusted. He was a showman, a self-taught scientist, a lecturer, a man who had spent his life drifting above fairgrounds in brightly colored balloons while crowds cheered below. He believed the air itself was the next frontier. In the spring of 1861, as the country fractured, Lowe was thinking of flight across the Atlantic. He had built a huge gas balloon for that purpose, but war halted his dream. Washington was filling with recruits, and rumors of Confederate armies marching on the capital spread daily. Lowe saw opportunity. From above, he realized a man could see miles of countryside, troop camps, river crossings, everything that scouts on horseback took days to discover. Height meant information, and information meant survival. He carried his proposal straight to the top. In early June, he inflated his balloon enterprise on the outskirts of the city, tethered it to the ground, and rose 1,000 feet into the clear air. There, using a small telegraph line that ran down the tether, he sent a message to the White House. It read simply, "From this height we command an extent of country nearly 50 miles in diameter. I respectfully invite you to witness the advantage which might be derived from the use of the balloon in the present war." President Abraham Lincoln read it with fascination. The idea of watching a battlefield from the clouds appealed to his sense of invention. Within days, he arranged to meet Lowe personally. Lincoln listened, asked questions, and finally said, "Find out what you can do, and I'll find out how to help you do it." That single sentence gave birth to America's first air arm, the Union Army Balloon Corps. Lowe began modestly. He and a few helpers built their first war balloon in a Washington workshop, naming it Union. It could lift a man and his instruments 1,000 feet into the air. But there was one problem: hydrogen. City gas mains could fill the balloon, but a mobile army needed its own source. So Lowe designed portable generators, wooden barrels packed with iron filings and acid that, when mixed, produced hydrogen on the march. He loaded them onto wagons drawn by mules. Wherever the army went, the sky could go with it. By the fall of 1861, the Union Army Balloon Corps officially existed, a handful of civilian aeronauts reporting to the topographical engineers. They had no uniforms, little funding, and even less respect. Line officers called them gas men. One general joked that they should report to the Weather Bureau, but Lincoln watched their experiments closely, and his curiosity protected them from early extinction. The soldiers kept laughing until the balloons started working. In September 1861, Lowe performed his first combat observation near Falls Church, Virginia. He rose from a clearing with a telegraph wire running down his tether to a Union artillery battery on the ground. From aloft, he spotted Confederate guns hidden in a patch of woods 3 miles away. He sent corrections through the wire, left 200 yards, elevate 50 feet. Moments later, the Union shells struck the target. It was the first time in American history that artillery had been directed from the air. The War Department noticed. What had been a curiosity became a tool. Lowe was ordered to continue. He expanded his fleet. Intrepid, Eagle, Excelsior, Constitution, United States. Each was larger, stronger, more capable. Crews built mobile gas stations and developed routines: inflate at dawn, ascend, signal, descend, pack, move. From Fort Corcoran and other defenses around Washington, the balloons rose daily. Observers drew panoramic sketches, noted campfires, counted tents. When enemy columns shifted, they sent warnings by telegraph. The capital was never taken, and some credited those silent sentinels above the Potomac. Still, skepticism lingered. Many generals distrusted civilian innovators. The army of the 1860s was steeped in tradition, and balloons didn't fit the manuals of tactics. But Lowe pressed on. He argued that reconnaissance saved lives, that one clear view from 1,000 feet could replace a dozen costly scouting missions. He was right, but few yet believed him. Early 1862 brought the chance to prove it. General George B. McClellan prepared to move his massive Army of the Potomac down the Virginia Peninsula toward Richmond. It was the largest American force ever assembled, more than 100,000 men, 10,000 wagons, and hundreds of cannon. McClellan, cautious and methodical, wanted every advantage he could get. Lowe convinced him that aerial reconnaissance would give him the eyes he lacked. The Balloon Corps joined the campaign. Wagons carrying gas generators jolted through rutted roads, mules strained, men cursed as acid splashed and valves jammed. But when the first balloon rose above the tree line near Yorktown, the panorama was astonishing. Observers saw Confederate fortifications stretching for miles, lines of trenches, gun pits, and camps. They drew maps that no ground scout could have imagined. For the first time, an army was moving guided by vision from the sky. Confederate soldiers watched the ascents with fascination. They shouted insults and fired occasional volleys, but the bullets fell short. One officer called the balloons "those damned Yankee moons." Another wrote that it was strange to see a man hanging in the heavens taking notes of your every move. It was the birth of a new kind of fear, the fear of being seen. At the Battle of Seven Pines in May 1862, Lowe's balloon Intrepid rose again. From 1,000 feet he could see entire divisions maneuvering through the swampy forest. He sent continuous reports to McClellan's headquarters. When a gap opened between Confederate brigades, Union artillery exploited it. Casualties on both sides were heavy, but McClellan avoided disaster. Afterward, he credited the balloon for timely intelligence. By midsummer, the balloons had become part of the Army's daily rhythm. Every dawn, pale shapes drifted upward, observers peering through field glasses, while telegraph operators waited below. When the wind grew rough, the cords creaked and the basket swayed. Sometimes they ascended at night, lanterns glowing faintly through the silk. To men in the trenches, it looked like a ghostly moon tethered to the earth. The Confederates tried to imitate the idea. They lacked the North's industrial base and had no supply of compressed gas, so they improvised. Dress silks were sewn together into patchwork envelopes. Hydrogen was replaced with hot air from wood fires. It worked, briefly. Captain John Bryan managed a few ascents near Yorktown, but nearly died when his tether twisted and snapped, sending him drifting out of control. Another balloon, called Gazelle, operated from the gunboat Teaser until Union forces captured both on the James River. That was the end of Confederate ballooning. For the South, chemistry and logistics had defeated courage. For the North, science had become a weapon. By the end of 1862, Lowe's corps numbered fewer than a dozen men, but their influence stretched far beyond their size. They had mapped river crossings, spotted ambushes, corrected artillery, and unnerved enemy commanders. Reports from observers routinely reached Washington before the generals themselves could send couriers. The telegraph and the balloon together compressed distance and time. War was becoming modern, but success bred enemies. Regular officers resented the civilians' independence and higher pay. Quartermasters complained about costs. Commanders argued over control. The Corps was shuffled from one department to another, losing support each time. Even Lincoln's interest could not shield it forever. Still, in those brief years, the air above Virginia belonged to Thaddeus Lowe. The winter of 1862 settled heavy on the peninsula. Mud swallowed horses. Wagons froze in place. Men huddled in tents and cursed the endless rain. Above them, the balloons still rose when weather allowed, their silk stiff with frost, their baskets dripping condensation that froze to ropes and fittings. From the ground they looked fragile, but they endured. From that height, Lowe could see the Confederate lines tightening around Richmond. He warned McClellan that the enemy was concentrating. The warning was ignored. On June 25th, the 7 days' battles began. For a week, the armies clashed along the Chickahominy River. Lowe's observers reported every shift of the front, every column marching across the valley. When Union lines broke at Gaines's Mill, the balloon Intrepid floated helplessly above the retreat, its cables stretched taut as the army fell back beneath it. When the fighting ended, McClellan's men had withdrawn to the James River. The campaign had failed, but not because the skies were blind. In his diary, one artilleryman wrote, "We thought the balloons were foolish at first. Now we wish we had one for every corps." Even defeat could not erase the advantage of vision. By midsummer, the balloons were operating from river barges to extend their reach. Lowe mounted one to a flatboat on the Potomac, another on the York. A simple tug could tow the platform into position. The balloon would rise straight from the deck. It was primitive naval aviation. Observers directed gunfire from gunboats onto Confederate batteries miles inland. When the smoke cleared, the maps drawn from those ascents were rolled up and sent to Washington, neat lines of ink that turned chaos into order. The Confederates took note. Their soldiers built decoys of logs to imitate cannon, stretched canvas over empty camps to mislead the watchers above, and moved troops at dusk to evade detection. But even when they could not see clearly through haze or fog, the very idea that someone might be watching changed their behavior. A balloon need not always observe to influence. Sometimes fear of observation was enough. Thaddeus Lowe became a familiar sight in Washington society. He dined with senators and scientists, explained his gas generators to visiting diplomats, and lectured to officers about the future of reconnaissance. He was only in his early 30s, but already graying from exhaustion and acid burns. Hydrogen was dangerous work. His hands were scarred, his clothes perpetually stained, his lungs raw from fumes. Yet he spoke about the promise of flight with quiet conviction. He believed the balloon was not an end, but a beginning. His wife, Leontine, kept the books and tended their equipment. When wagons broke down, she found replacements. When suppliers balked at hauling chemicals, she negotiated new contracts. Few knew that much of the Corps' efficiency came from her order rather than his inspiration. In early 1863, the Corps reached its height. 7 balloons in active service, dozens of trained crew, telegraph specialists, and sketch artists. They operated almost entirely independently, moving where needed. Their records for that year list hundreds of ascents and thousands of hours aloft. They had become routine, part of the daily machinery of war. And in routine, novelty fades. Generals who had once praised Lowe began to see his men as expendable technicians. Funding was cut. Supplies arrived late. Pay was reduced. The Balloon Corps became just another line item in a bloated budget. In May 1863, Lowe resigned. He wrote that without proper support, no efficiency can be expected nor credit given. He left the army quietly, carrying with him boxes of notes and sketches, fragments of a vision half realized. The Corps limped on under new leadership, but its energy was gone. By August, it was formally dissolved. The wagons were sold for scrap. The silk envelopes rotted in warehouses. After 2 years, America's first air service ceased to exist. Yet even as it died, the world was taking notice. European observers attached to Union headquarters had watched the experiments with keen interest. Among them were engineers from France, Britain, and Prussia, nations already dabbling with aeronautics but without battlefield experience. Reports describing the Union balloons circulated through military academies overseas. One Prussian officer, a young Ferdinand von Zeppelin, later claimed that his fascination with rigid airships began after seeing an American balloon ascent during the war. What had been a sideshow in Virginia became a seed of modern reconnaissance doctrine. In France, veterans of the Civil War experiments advised on balloon use during the Siege of Paris in 1870. In Britain, the Royal Engineers studied Lowe's telegraph methods. Within decades, observation balloons would become standard equipment for every major army. From silk bags over the Potomac would come hydrogen giants over the Marne and the Somme. Back home, the legacy was quieter. When newspapers mentioned the balloons, it was usually as curiosities. Few soldiers who had fought on the ground understood how much of their commander's information had come from those fragile platforms in the clouds. The Corps had been a tool of intelligence, and intelligence leaves little glory. There were no battle honors for seeing first, no medals for observing, but the memory lingered in letters and journals. Union veterans recalled the floating watchers. Confederates remembered the unnerving sight of a figure high above, motionless, patient. One called it the stare of God. After the war, Lowe returned to civilian invention. He developed gas lighting systems for cities, refrigeration equipment for shipping, and later founded a mountain railway in California that bore his name. He never again ascended in war, but he never doubted that others would. "The future of observation," he wrote, "belongs to those who hold the air." At first, no one paid much attention, but when the 20th century arrived and men began fitting engines to wings, the path from those early balloons became unmistakable. The first reconnaissance planes in World War I used the same logic, the same idea: height as knowledge. Artillery observers sent coded messages down wires, just as Lowe had done. The technology had changed, the principle had not. In the Civil War, balloons had been a curiosity. In the next wars, they would become necessities. By 1918, thousands of observers hung in steel-framed balloons along the Western Front, directing fire for guns that could reach 30 miles. Many were shot down, their silk and gas igniting into pillars of flame. Their deaths were part of a lineage that began with laughter in a Virginia field. And when planes replaced them, and cameras replaced sketchbooks, and satellites replaced planes, the logic continued still. Every conflict since has followed the rule first proven by a handful of aeronauts. He who sees first strikes first. He who is seen suffers. Lowe lived long enough to read about flight heavier than air. He saw photographs of the Wright brothers and smiled. Friends said he felt vindicated. He died in 1913, the same year reconnaissance planes flew over the Balkans for the first time. The age of military aviation had begun on the ground he had prepared half a century earlier. By then, the names of his balloons, Union, Intrepid, Excelsior, were forgotten by most. But their spirit hovered behind every observer leaning from a cockpit, every satellite operator tracing lines on a screen, every commander who paused before striking and asked, "Have we seen enough?" That question began with a man in a wicker basket over a muddy river, scribbling notes while enemy gunners laughed below. When Confederate soldiers first saw the balloon rise above the Chickahominy, they joked that the Yankees had finally lost their minds. By the end of the campaign, they no longer joked. They hid their camps under trees, they moved their guns at night, they covered their fires. The laughter had vanished. In its place was a new kind of fear, the fear of being watched, of having no secrets. That fear never left warfare again. They laughed at the balloon. They laughed at the man who believed air could be tamed, but the sky remembered, and every war since has proved him right. Even after the Balloon Corps disappeared, the Army's archives preserved Lowe's reports. For decades, they gathered dust in government files, referenced only by weather clerks and mapmakers. When later officers examined them, they found a new vocabulary written in a civilian hand: altitude, visibility, line of sight, bearing, elevation. Concepts that would become routine in 20th century doctrine had first appeared there, scrawled in pencil beside sketches of the Virginia countryside. Military institutions are slow to change. In the years that followed, generals returned to the ground. They trusted cavalry scouts and field glasses more than clouds and wind. The Civil War ended as it began, by rail, by musket, by trench. But the idea of the sky as high ground was not forgotten. A few veterans carried it west. During the Indian Wars, small tethered balloons were proposed for frontier outposts, but rejected as impractical. During the Spanish-American War, officers again tested observation balloons over Cuba. They found the same truths Lowe had learned. The view was priceless, the gas dangerous, the equipment fragile, and the funding uncertain. Progress in war often repeats its lessons until someone finally listens. The next to listen were in Europe. By the 1880s, France had permanent balloon companies. Britain followed with its own. Germany built hydrogen sheds and steel winches capable of raising observers thousands of feet. Every nation learned from the notes of the Americans who had tried it first. What began with ropes and wicker in Virginia evolved into steel cables, radio telephones, and cameras. In 1900, Count Zeppelin's first rigid airship rose from a lake in southern Germany. Its frame gleamed in sunlight, a metallic descendant of the silk giants that had once drifted over the Potomac. When asked what inspired him, Zeppelin recalled seeing a Union balloon while visiting the United States decades earlier. He remembered the wonder, the silence, and the thought that one day men might not merely rise into the air, but travel through it with purpose. From that seed grew an empire of airships, some carrying tourists, others bombs. Lowe had watched battlefields. Zeppelin's creations would make them. Back in America, the memory of the Balloon Corps was nearly erased by other stories. The nation preferred its heroes, clear and simple: Grant, Lee, Sherman, Jackson. The scientists of war seldom fit the legend, but among engineers the tale of Thaddeus Lowe endured like a rumor. At West Point, cadets studying topography read his reports on atmospheric distortion. At the Naval Academy, instructors cited his river barges as the first examples of shipborne aerial observation. Without ceremony, the odd little corps that no one wanted had entered the textbooks. When the First World War began, France launched observation balloons along the front. They were immense cylinders of rubberized fabric tethered by steel cable, each with telephone lines running down to artillery units below. They climbed higher than Lowe's men had ever dared, 3,000, sometimes 5,000 feet, and stayed aloft for hours. Observers reported the flash of enemy guns, then watched their own counter-batteries strike back. From 1914 to 1918, thousands of men fought and died in those baskets. They called them sausages. The nickname hid the terror: hydrogen, tracer fire, parachutes that sometimes failed. Each time one exploded, a white column rose into the gray sky, marking the spot where the dream of vision met the cost of vulnerability. Those men did not know Thaddeus Lowe's name, but they followed his path exactly, tethered to the ground by a cable, watching, guiding, learning the same lesson, that the air belongs to whoever dares to climb first. In the Second World War, the principle grew wings. Reconnaissance planes crossed continents, their cameras replacing human sketchbooks. Pilots used the same geometry that balloonists once calculated with compass and string: angle, distance, shadow, range. When radar arrived, it simply automated what the human eye had begun. By the time satellites orbited the Earth, the lineage from silk to silicon was complete. Every high-resolution image of a battlefield, every weather forecast before an invasion, every guided weapon tracing coordinates down to a square meter, all of it could trace a line back to a handful of aeronauts over the Virginia woods. That continuity is invisible but unmistakable. Innovation in war rarely announces itself with thunder. It drifts upward quietly, like a balloon. For the men who served in the 1860s, that quiet ascent seemed almost supernatural. Letters from Union soldiers speak of standing in the trenches, craning their necks to watch the faint silhouette overhead. They felt a strange comfort knowing someone up there could see beyond the horizon. It made them feel less blind. Confederate diaries told the opposite feeling: unease, helplessness, even superstition. One private wrote that the Yankees have found a way to spy from heaven. For a generation raised in churches and farms, the notion of eyes in the sky carried a weight deeper than tactics. It hinted that human conflict had entered a new realm, one where secrecy itself could die. After the war, those same veterans looked at the stars differently. Some saw promise, others warning. They had glimpsed what happened when invention outran understanding. It would happen again, many times. Thaddeus Lowe's later years were quieter. He invested his war earnings into enterprises that rose and fell like the balloons he once flew. In Pasadena, California, he built a mountain railway that carried tourists into the clouds. He told them stories of his ascents over Richmond. Few believed such things had happened so long ago. He smiled and let them doubt. By then he understood that disbelief is the natural companion of discovery. When he died in 1913, the Los Angeles papers gave him a few paragraphs: pioneer balloonist, inventor, aged 80. They did not mention that armies around the world were already using his methods. They did not say that the first bomb ever dropped from an airplane would fall only a year later. History rarely warns the living that they are repeating the past. The record of the Union Army Balloon Corps remains one of paradox. It achieved little that could be measured in battles won or territory gained, yet it changed the geometry of warfare. Its successes were invisible: better maps, fewer surprises, clearer sight. Its failures were loud: tangled cables, storms, political feuds. But within those contradictions lay the pattern of every military innovation to come: doubted, ridiculed, indispensable. They laughed at the balloon. They laughed at the man who dared to see war from above. Then they built empires on the vision he left behind. History often moves forward without anyone noticing. The soldiers on the Chickahominy that morning thought they were fighting the same kind of war their fathers had known: mud, muskets, and courage. They could not see that the future was already above them, silent and observing. The balloon did not change the outcome of the Civil War. The Union would win because of industry, manpower, and time. But the balloon changed the method of war. It turned information into a weapon. It proved that vision itself could shape a battlefield. Every generation since has built on that truth. The wires that once carried Lowe's messages became radio signals. The sketches drawn in pencil became photographs, then radar screens, then streams of digital data. The eye in the sky never closed again. From the mud of Virginia to the vacuum of orbit, the line is unbroken. The same instinct that lifted a man in a wicker basket now lifts machines beyond the atmosphere. The purpose has not changed: to see, to know, to control. When people look back, they often search for the moment when the modern age began. Some point to the railroad, others to the telegraph, still others to the engine. But another beginning waits quietly in the spring of 1862, in a field beside the Chickahominy, where a handful of soldiers stopped laughing and started watching the sky. They had witnessed something that could not be undone. From that day forward, no army would ever again march unobserved. The battlefield had gained a third dimension. The Confederates never understood how much those first balloons mattered until it was too late. They could destroy railroads, burn bridges, sink ships, but they could not hide from the air. And once a weapon of vision exists, it cannot be forgotten. Thaddeus Lowe did not live to see satellites or spy planes, but he would have recognized their purpose instantly. He had proved a principle that no nation could ignore. He who commands the view commands the fight. The sky has no borders. It listens, it records, it remembers. What began as laughter in the Virginia dawn became the foundation of every eye that watches from above today. Each photograph from space, each reconnaissance flight, each drone that circles a modern battlefield carries a shadow of that first ascent. The same curiosity, the same disbelief, the same silence that followed when the impossible became real. They laughed at hot air balloons. They did not laugh for long.